Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is episode 35 of Changing the Face of Yoga with Charlotte Nessel. Charlotte combines experiential learning with focusing on positive experiences to change the pathways in the brain and how all that fits together with yoga. Let's listen. Hello, this is Stephanie Cunningham with Changing the Face of Yoga, and we have a very interesting guest today, Charlotte Nessel. She's a certified yoga therapist, and she creates experiential learning that weaves in positive neuroplasticity. In other words, the capacity we have to shape our brain towards the good. And I think that's going to be a really exciting thing to talk about. She's facilitating a small group class with a local psychologist on integrating trauma. She also has stated that she is tuning into her own nervous system, and that allows her to be present for those that she serves like never before. It also lets them be present in their lives. So we're going to be talking about some really interesting things today. Charlotte, is there anything you would like to add to that introduction?
In terms of anything else to add to that introduction, no, not at all. No. Will I be able to maybe provide you with one or two links that you could have with your podcast if somebody wanted to connect with me?
You've given me your email and your website. And
yes.
I'll say that at the end, and I'll also put it in the show notes.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
I think what you have is just lovely.
Okay, great. I'm really interested in this idea of experiential learning that weaves in positive neuroplasticity. Let's start first with, how would you define positive neuroplasticity?
Positive neuroplasticity is a wonderful concept, and I wish it was on the front page of every newspaper. Neuroplasticity has to do with the reality that our brain is shaped through our whole life. I did my undergraduate studies in gerontology, and 20 years ago, this was news, and it's amazing how it's still news. Like we take that in conceptually, mentally, but we don't act in our lives as though it's true. We really have this capacity to shape our brains toward things that help us to enjoy our lives, live more fully, have more well-being, things like that support our immune system to function better, more positive emotions that support resilience. I can talk a little bit about this because this is an area that I've been dedicating myself and my work to for some time now. And I draw on the work of Dr. Rick Hansen primarily, as well as others. And one of the things that I think was so helpful for me to understand is that as human beings, our brains evolved with this extra focus on the negative. Our brains hone in on the negative around us. It's called a negativity bias. And that's a survival mechanism. Our ancestors, if they missed a cue like to watch the sun setting or to enjoy sitting around a fire with their loved ones, they'd have an opportunity to have those experiences again. But if they missed a cue of danger and they didn't react and it was actually life-threatening, they wouldn't have been able to pass on their genes to us. So the way our brains have evolved is that we have the skittery, kind of anxious, looking around tendencies to keep ourselves safe. And that's great, but there's so many more ways that our systems get triggered to fight or flight these days, that it's important to, I think it's important to name that negativity bias, because it helps to give us some leverage to kind of get curious. Well, is this situation really as difficult as I'm perceiving it to be? Like, is it really likely that there's a tiger out the front door? And yet my nervous system is reacting that way. And on the other part of that, is it really true that I'm not up for this task that's in front of me? Because that's also a way that the negativity bias shows up.
If you feel unable to do something.
Yeah, like you don't have what it takes.
Okay.
That could be all kinds of reasons, but one of the things of the negativity bias is feeling like, yes, the challenges are much bigger than you could possibly ever be successful in dealing with.
What you're talking about then is the positive neuroplasticity. There we go. And how we can change over from the negative to the positive. Is that correct?
Yes, our brain actually records negative experiences very quickly, but it takes more effort and attention to record positive experiences. So, for example, in my own life, I've been prone to worry. And what I found is that when my thinking goes down a certain tunnel of, thinking, oh, well, I haven't heard from my friend. I wonder if she still likes me. This has been my best friend for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And yet, isn't it funny how those kinds of thoughts can get going?
Let's talk about positive neuroplasticity. You say that
Okay.
The brain, for some reason, it takes more effort for the brain to remember or use positive experiences. Now, I understand that it probably needed to do the negative so that we could stay alive, but can we shift our brain to the more positive, or do we just have to kind of work around it?
I think, Stephanie, there's one point that comes to mind here, which is this saying, neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is that when there's repeated activity in the brain, we know that connections start to happen. Well, in the recent research, there was a study of London taxi cab drivers who, for their living, need to memorize the streets of London. They need to be able to orient themselves in all kinds of situations to be able to get from point A to point B if there's a traffic jam. So when their brains were imaged, it showed a thickening in the parts of the brain that have to do with how they can orient themselves in their environment, how they can navigate their environment. Now, how does this apply to your question? Well, that study, as well as another study on meditators that probably most of your listeners are familiar with, that showed that meditators' brains thickened in areas that had to do, for example, with directing attention, because we know that's one of our mind is trained through meditation. Our mind wanders and we bring it back to our breath. Our mind wanders and we bring it back to our breath. So those two studies illustrate this idea about the second point of this idea of neurons that fire together, wire together, is that when there's repeated mental activity, there's repeated neural activity in our brain. And so those studies are examples of that when we focus our attention in a certain direction over and over again, we start to cultivate new neural pathways. And the more we cultivate them, the more we deepen new pathways for ourselves. And when we cultivate them towards the good things in our lives, then we start to deepen new pathways a really common one would be, for example, gratitude. To genuinely have a feeling of gratitude in our body. So we can start with bringing to mind a memory of a time when we were grateful, maybe at a holiday time or a time with a pet or a loved one or a friend, or maybe a time when we were in nature and just feeling this just abundance all around us. And then we just allow our attention to stay with it, to linger for 10, 20, 30 seconds. And as best as we can to feel it in our body. Those are the three of the parts of Rick Hanson's model of how we can lay down new neural pathways that are in the direction of the positive, of taking in the good. The reason why we want to shape our brains towards the good is we know there's so much benefit towards having more resilience coming back from challenges. We're just able to recover that much better. We have more happiness. We're willing to take more risks. We feel more confident. We're able to express our needs more, those kinds of things.
When you're talking about gratitude, I have noticed, and I'm a bit surprised by this, to be honest, that if I start the day with a gratitude meditation, and it might be, 10 minutes, or just saying, gee, I'm really grateful for all of these wonderful things in my life, I've noticed that there really is a shift in mental attitude for a good part of the day. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And when you describe a shift in mental attitude, Stephanie, could we just go there for a moment?
Well, I guess, when you get right down to it, I guess it's resiliency in that, if the podcast interview isn't going well or the technology's driving me crazy, which happens often, I'm afraid, I somehow get through it more easily than if I hadn't done that gratitude. Now, it doesn't happen on one day. You have to do it for, at least I have to do it for a couple of weeks or so. But I have noticed that, and then I've noticed that if I stop doing it for some reason, that old attitude of getting upset about stuff comes back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Stephanie, your example I think is really spot on. And what I want to kind of shout out about your example is a couple things. One is you mentioned that you really noticed a difference when you had a gratitude practice going and when you didn't have a gratitude practice going. And there it is, right there in a nutshell. Absolutely. I think that it's kind of like when we do our breathing practices or when we do our, asana practice or a meditation practice of any kind, we benefit when we do it. There's some carryover, but as we're strengthening in new ways, like when we want to work out at the gym and I want to strengthen, an area of my body maybe where I've had an injury and now I'm rehabbing, it's really important that we really attend to that area and really bring it on board and really develop those muscle groups that we need to be working with. The same is true with the positive neuroplasticity. It takes a little bit of effort, but on the other hand, the experience of, for example, of genuinely feeling grateful. Now, I don't mean, feeling grateful, feeling guilty about, I should feel grateful, but really, authentically, what am I genuinely grateful for? And just letting it land in the body somewhere. Maybe there's a feeling of warmth around my heart or a softening in my belly. Those kinds of experiences, the more we can notice them, the more it helps that experience. Our brain gets like the message, wow, she's really interested in this.
Okay. I don't know that I've really let it sit in my body, but I think I can add that easily. I didn't realize you were supposed to do that too. So
yeah, that's part of the neuroplasticity training of Rick Hanson's model. And it's a lovely model. It's simple. And I think those of us that have been working with training our attention, it's a useful model to explore. It surely has been for me.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely put him in the links on the show notes so that people can explore that for themselves. Now, can we kind of go into experiential learning? Because I have a feeling that these two are connected in some way. First of all, I'm pretty sure I understand what experiential learning is, but you never know. So could you just give me a definition?
Well, experiential learning, wow. As a yoga therapist, I'm imagining some of my colleagues are on the line, as well as yoga practitioners and maybe people of other orientations, yoga teachers. For all of us, there's this common thread of perhaps an interest in growing self-awareness, of ways that we can affect our own well-being. And I think that the idea of experiential learning has really taken on another level of appreciation for me when I understand that naming an experience and really allowing myself to sense it in my body. And I'm specifically talking about growing the good in me, which is not my term. I'm specifically thinking in that regard. But we also know that naming unpleasant experiences also help us to step back a little and be a witness. So I think the idea of something landing experientially, for example, if I share a practice, what is the real effect? Like, what is the effect that I think me as the guide imagines will happen? But then everyone is so incredibly different. What's the actual, experience someone has when I invite them to go inside? For some people, some of my work is with people who've experienced trauma. When someone's gone through real difficulty, going inside, slowing down, checking in can be really overwhelming. So just assuming that these kinds of practices across the board have the same impact. I think the thing about experiential learning is being willing to kind of roll up my sleeves and get in there and kind of be in the exploration with the people that are practicing with me around, well, how is this landing? And, what can we learn about this right now?
When you talk about doing experiential learning, then you're giving them practices in yoga that probably most of us would at least recognize, if not having done. But you're trying to work with people who you think this kind of learning would be helpful. You said earlier that even looking at negative experiences, you actually kind of take yourself away and become a witness instead of experiencing it as if it is happening to you. Is that one thing that you're trying to achieve?
It's very interesting. You have such good questions. I think one of the things about experiential learning is it's really dependent on who's in front of me, really, about the aim. So, for example, if someone in front of me and their aim is to learn how to care for their lower back, then my focus is going to be on how to help them increase awareness of their lower back and what feels good and what doesn't feel good, and over time, what seems to be beneficial. More and more, though, one of my underlying themes is to support people in recognizing their own goodness, and B, how they can take that in and take in experiences of goodness, because by taking them in, we're actually developing a capacity inside of ourselves to be stronger. So I think the experiential piece is making it conscious, making the process of internalizing those circumstances or memories or interactions we're having with people, loved ones, pets, really letting them land inside. That's one part of it. Another part of it is in the yoga realm, is to devote our yoga practice toward whatever intention is, needs our priority. For me, when I'm at the gym and I'm working out with weights, for example, before I do my asana practice, my aim is to really be experientially tuned into, okay, how is my body responding to this right now? Is this feeling like what I need? Do I need to be open to adapting? Do I need somebody else's eyes because I'm working in a blind spot? That kind of thing.
I want to make sure I understand, because there's almost an underlying theme there that a lot of us don't live in our bodies. that we don't pay attention?
Oh, Stephanie, that's a beautiful thing to name. And I think that the important thing about it for me is how as I cultivate awareness, that's how I was introduced to mindfulness, was through the yogic understanding of awareness, of self-awareness. As I cultivate awareness, some of what I get in touch with inside of myself is challenging. And how do I turn towards that with kindness? Because we know that kindness and having compassion for my own suffering is what sets the stage for possibility for more healing and integration to happen. So I think that underlying, as you're saying, the reality is that for many of us, we can benefit very much from being kinder to ourselves. And so these kinds of practices, to ground them in this turning in, it's all well and good to turn in and feel all comfortable and go inside when everything's going well. But when things aren't going well, when I'm feeling, at the end of my rope, or when I react to someone else, or, have a strong opinion, or when I get afraid, at those times when I go inside, it's a whole different experience. And how do I cultivate that capacity to turn toward myself in those kinds of experiences? I think that's the benefit of experiential learning, and it's kind of something we talked about earlier around being able to step back a little, but I think really there's a lot to it. One part of it is the being kind towards ourselves too. It's not all of it, but that's definitely a big piece, I think, for many of us.
Could you give us an example of what you would call experiential learning if you were working with clients or a client?
Okay, sure. When I lead my trauma-sensitive yoga group, one of the aims I have is to create experiences where participants can feel inside themselves places of safety, or places of connection, places of well-being. So one of the examples that comes to mind is just last week, I led a meditation on imagine that your feet are rooted on the earth, and that your legs are bringing that strength up, and that strength is coming up through your trunk and up through your heart, and you feel yourself breathing. And then I took that into an image of imagine a tree, and imagine just the strength of that tree that allows it to be upright, and see if you can feel that somewhere in your own body, like that kind of an experience, so that I'm not just kind of tossing out an idea, but I'm helping people find it in their own experience.
I like that. I mean, I can understand very well. Yeah.
Great.
And
Thank you.
I really have never been involved with a meditation that did that asks you to, other than saying, do some deep breathing and get relaxed.
Exactly. I think the potential for many of us who have been oriented toward a personal practice is this gives us another whole set of tools, if you will, to take our integration more, to make that more, to have it land more.
And if you take this idea, the experiential learning, and you meld it with the positive experiences that you're trying to achieve with neuroplasticity, you're trying to be more positive, to feel more, to be kind to yourself. I would think that would be overall difficult, but a positive experience. Is that a fair statement?
Can I give you a long answer? When I was 18, I'm 60 years old. When I was 18, I moved into what was then Kripalu Ashram and lived there for almost 20 years. So I was introduced to yoga as a lifestyle. And it was more than a particular asana or a particular practice. It was an attitude. It was a way of kind of going about my life, really. Now, one of the things that is, I think it's fair to say about our culture is that we live within a culture that seems to separate the body and the mind or the spirit. Like these are all different parts of ourselves. And I think what's really true is that we've all had experiences in Shavasana, for example, where we've really felt ourselves deeply settle and land. And how do we experience that? Well, we might have those thoughts in our mind of like, oh, I can really feel my back relaxing. But we also feel it in our body, like we feel that letting go, that ease. And I think it's bringing that kind of awareness. Now, see, in some of the work I do, I work with, as I mentioned already, people who are diagnosed with PTSD. That's one group of participants in one of my classes. Another group are women who are on healing journeys with breast cancer. And in those kind of specialty groups, really a big aim for me is to have the group feel very inclusive. So I'm not bringing in really complicated movement. I'm bringing in movement that's just very doesn't stir the pot in terms of somebody might feel like they're comparing themselves because, even raising their arm might be difficult if they're in chronic pain. Or so I think it's about slowing down and having a different priority. And I think that's where this work has shaped me in a really beautiful way that I hadn't experienced in quite the same way before, where really my aim is to help people connect in their body with feeling safe as we go through moment to moment. Like that's my whole aim. How do I do that? Moment to moment, when somebody's in chronic pain, when somebody's feeling the loss that they've experienced because of illness, or the lack of feeling that they have what it takes to recover from this, big long healing journey they've been on. Those kinds of things. What I want my work to do is to kind of help build them back up, to help them find without stirring, without triggering. When we do this kind of work, this isn't like a training for anybody. I'm not, it's an interview process, but, it's really important to acknowledge that even in doing good things together for people who've got different experiences in their past, even in doing something good, we don't know what someone's experience is inside. It may feel good for me, but for them, it might feel frightening. It might remind them of a time when they didn't feel safe, when someone was being hurtful towards them. So there's so many things.
So how do you modify, shall we say, to let people find a safe place inside them? Because as you say, there's no way for you to completely know what feels safe for them individually.
I think one of the things I'll just mention is I have a trauma webinar. It's called Tuning into Your Nervous System and Healing Trauma. I'm just going to put a plug for it. It's a free webinar, and I think if anybody's interested in this topic, I would totally invite you in that direction to sign up for that. I know Stephanie's going to have a link to my website, and you can contact me there. But I think it's really important to recognize that if you're working in this realm, I'm specifically naming things that could be traumatic for people. Certainly facing breast cancer could be traumatic. PTSD could be traumatic. We know many people have experienced something that's traumatic because they haven't felt supported. And it's kind of a bigger conversation than maybe what we have time for here. But what I'd really encourage is to not use those terms lightly, like healing and trauma, and to really kind of be in the inquiry for a while. I found that for myself, small groups and having someone that I can mentor with, honestly, that specifically works in this field, so that as I'm aware that our experiences are shaping our brain, I want to be aware about how to help experiences land in a way that are as digestible and supportive as I can, rather than in deepening the grooves that we know just don't help, right?
I really want to thank you for saying that you want to invite people not to use terms like healing and trauma lightly. It seems like everybody's into trauma sensitive yoga these days, and I just want you to have my gratitude, shall we say, of saying this is a pretty serious
Mhm.
thing, and we need to be careful in what we say and what we do in that area. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank
Um,
you. Yeah.
and you have a mentor. I think that's wonderful also. I think we could all use a mentor, at least on occasion, if not consistently.
I find around that, Stephanie, that in this area for me, around my own growing in this area, it's been really valuable because I definitely have my own blind spots. I have, my own needs that show up and can filter. I look out through my eyes, and I'm looking out through the eyes of maybe my own unmet needs. And really, my aim more and more is to at least be able to know that when I'm leading my group, at least be able to know what's my experience right now, and what does this person in front of me need? So there's a couple things about that. One is to be able to know my own experience. The second is, for me anyway, to be able to turn towards myself with kindness, and know that I can come back to that later, that I don't have to meet those needs on the spot. And then the other part is, having a listening for who's in front of me and how to be skillful. So it's actually quite a lot.
Yes,
There's a lot
yes, there
going on.
are, or is, or
and, and that's with one person, but then you add a couple of people, and it's like, wow, it gets kind of juicy
um,
sometimes.
you had one statement in what you sent to me, which was tuning into my own nervous system allows me to be present for those that I serve like never before. Is that pretty much what we've been talking about? Is having kindness for yourself and looking at perhaps what your blind spots might be, and is that, are those concrete examples, shall we say, of knowing your nervous system better?
Yeah, I think for myself, a concrete example for myself is that I've how I've managed myself is often through getting revved up inside, and kind of, it's like the fight response kicking in. And as someone who's been in a long-term marriage, you know it's not such a useful tool in marriage, is it, to respond to my beloved that way? And so, kind of in a really practical, concrete example, some of that healing can happen through doing asana and pranayama and meditation. Some of that healing happens with a mentor that kind of allows me to have a safe space to explore those kinds of things. Some of that healing happens as I'm in my relationship and I'm doing new things, and taking responsibility for my own needs. And so there's kind of a lot to that question, but those are some examples. And I think that all of that has strengthened my capacity to do this kind of work. And actually, I'm going to be offering an online course about tuning into our nervous system and trusting its goodness in the new year. It's an online course, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody about that. I have a early bird wait list that you can sign up for until December 8th. So I encourage anybody that's interested to reach out, and we can
All
set up a
right,
time to
great.
chat.
It's on your website, so they would, or is it an email that you would want them to contact you?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking. I think my sales page goes up November 8th, but
Yes, I
fingers
do.
crossed, you know how that goes. So we can definitely, we can definitely have my website, my email, and if there's any problem, just to have
Okay.
them, maybe email's
Okay,
best,
so
just to be
Charlotte's
on the safe
email
side.
is
Yeah.
Charlotte, and that's CharloTTE
Uh-huh.
at charlottenessel.com. And I will spell that too. It's
Yeah.
SCharlotteNUESSLE.com. Okay, because that's not an easy one, I think, to automatically understand. Okay, and her website, in case it does come up, and we're all hoping that it does, is www.charlottenessel.com. That sounds really interesting, Charlotte. I hope that there's a lot of people that are listening that can take advantage of this, because although I think we had a really good interview, I have a feeling that we just kind of touched on the surface, because this is a very complex area. And as you said, it's 20 years later, neuroplasticity is still this new wonderful idea, when actually it's kind of an old idea by now. But to actually take that into yoga and use it in your way, in experiential learning, I think we could probably have a whole series on that on the podcast. So I really want to thank you. I think this has been a really fascinating one. I've talked to other people that have talked about trauma, but this is the first time I think I've ever heard this kind of take on it. And I think it's really an interesting one to, first of all, accentuate the positive in the brain with neuroplasticity, and then to work into experiential learning for individuals. So
people really respond, Stephanie. I appreciate that reflection a lot. People respond. They really, like, people love, like, they're, because, when you've been overwhelmed with feeling just so frightened or invisible, or, is it safe for me here? Can I show up here? And then you have this experience of this part inside of you where you can kind of relax and, remember joy. What was it like when I, swam in that river, or was feeling the wind on my skin? I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's a real gift.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. And I think this is a really unique way to look at how to help people, well, how to interact with people who may be experiencing some difficulties in their life. So, like breast cancer, which I'm sure is very, very difficult. So, thank you so much.
I so appreciate your great work, Stephanie. Such a gift to be interviewed by you, and you're you're providing
Thank
such
you.
a service.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.